Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really immersing ourselves in a crisis that just instantly became a global flashpoint. The Pahalgam terrorist attack of April 2025. This deep dive is, well, it's our way to get a handle on not just the tragedy itself, but the whole backdrop. Decades of proxy warfare, strategic denial, and these really deep geopolitical contradictions that all sort of culminated in that one brutal event.
Exactly. And it's such a crucial topic because Pahalgam, well, it isn't just some isolated incident, right? It's a direct reflection of this incredibly volatile equilibrium between two nuclear powers. Our mission today is to synthesize the sources, look at the details of the attack, the immediate diplomatic shockwave, and critically, this really complex, almost baffling role Pakistan plays in regional terrorism. We really need to examine the evidence, the stuff that leads scholars to call Islamabad's policy, well, a dangerous double game.
Right. The stage for this was set April 22nd, 2025 in Pahalgam, Kashmir. And when you think of Pahalgam, you typically picture, the stunning Litter Valley, those high-altitude meadows. It's the starting point for the Amarnath Yatra pilgrimage. It was really the epitome of a Kashmiri tourist haven. And the sources really stress that this specific target, it wasn't random. It feels deliberate.
Oh, absolutely deliberate. It was a strategic choice, targeting soft, high-visibility civilian sites. Gunmen just opened fire, indiscriminately. Maximum chaos, maximum casualties. And the outcome was horrific. At least 26 people killed, mostly domestic tourists, people from all over India. So by attacking a place associated with peaceful tourism, religious pilgrimage even, the perpetrators guaranteed the biggest possible emotional and political fallout across India.
And that escalation, it was immediate, almost visceral, wasn't it? Initial reports pointed towards the Resistance Front, or TRF, and that accusation, it led pretty quickly to India's retaliatory action operation Sindoor. That was May 2025. And then Pakistan hit back. So we really need to understand the external dimensions New Delhi kept stressing, even while the facts on the ground was still emerging.
Yes, that combination of terrorism, high-level state rhetoric, and the strategic denial, what we're calling the double game, that's what makes this particular flashpoint so incredibly volatile. For the international community, Pahalgam immediately presented this huge challenge. How do you respond? A major attack happens, but the state accused of backing it issues an instant, really vehement denial. So it forces us to unpack the sources to really understand the historical context that makes that denial instantly suspect for so many observers.
Okay, let's do that. Let's unpack the specifics of the event itself in that initial investigation. The sources that detail the violence, they really emphasize the nature of the attack itself. It's rapid, indiscriminate, close quarters, just designed to overwhelm civilians. And after that initial chaos, the finger of blame, it pointed straight at the Resistance Front, TRF.
And here's where it gets, well, intriguing when you look at the sources. TRF, this militant group active in Jammu and Kashmir, they were the initial suspect. But then almost immediately they issued a denial. Now, for Indian officials and intelligence agencies, this wasn't taken as a sign of innocence. No, it was seen as a calculated move, a strategic maneuver, probably by the group's alleged Pakistani handlers, trying to minimize the diplomatic fallout, right? Create distance, manufacture plausible deniability the second the attack succeeded.
Okay, but if the focus was immediately on this external sponsorship, the initial investigation findings, well, they paint a slightly more complicated picture for New Delhi's narrative, don't they? India stressed the external link, but the people publicly arrested were local facilitators.
Yes, the focus shifted very quickly to the overground workers, the OGWs. These are the local collaborators, and they're absolutely indispensable for any kind of cross-border militant operation. They're usually not the ones pulling the trigger, but they provide that critical logistical support. Reconnaissance safe houses, local intel, arranging transport, you name it.
The sources specifically mentioned the arrests of a teacher and a resident from Kulgam as key OGWs. So for you listening, why are these OGW arrests so important, and how do they sort of complicate that narrative of a purely external attack?
Well, they're the operational necessity, aren't they? They link the militants, the attackers, to the local environment. If you arrest the OGWs, you essentially cut off the logistic tail. It's a huge win for domestic counterterrorism efforts. However, and this is the complication, if New Delhi is consistently stressing the external dimension, saying this was sanctioned by Pakistan, yet the only publicly named arrests are local collaborators, it creates this kind of intelligence vacuum. It allows skeptics, both domestic and international, to ask, okay, where are the foreign operatives? Where's the proof of the direct link? So India's claim of external orchestration, while consistent with their overall stance, it lacked that immediate, publicly verifiable smoking gun, in those first few weeks after the attack.
And this ambiguity, It seems like it was mirrored in the international response, too.
Precisely. The UN Security Council, they did condemn the killings. That's standard procedure, of course, for any mass casualty event like this. But, and this is significant, they deliberately stopped short of assigning direct blame to any nation. That cautious wording, which you saw reflected in major capitals around the world, it acknowledges the horror of the attack, but it also tries to navigate this incredibly volatile geopolitical reality. The stakes involved, two nuclear-armed rivals. They were just too high for any immediate decisive attribution from neutral bodies based only on the publicly available evidence at that point.
Right, and that cautious international response, it really gave Pakistan the strategic opening they needed, didn't it? As you almost expect, their denial strategy was immediate, it was vigorous, and, well, completely consistent with their history.
The denial mechanism kicked in instantly. Islamabad just flatly rejected India's accusations. They labeled the whole claim a false flag operation, specifically designed, they argued, to justify the cross-border aggression that India then carried out. You had high-level Pakistani officials, Defense Minister Khwaja Asif, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. They demanded independent investigations into Pahalgam, even raised it at the UN General Assembly.
In New Delhi, predictably perhaps, just categorically rejected any idea of a joint or independent probe. Their argument being, sharing sensitive intelligence on active terrorist networks operating from Pakistan would compromise ongoing operations. It was a non-starter. And this leads us straight to the core of the diplomatic stalemate, Pakistan's long-standing credibility problem.
This denial, it isn't just a one-off tactic for this incident. It's part of a deeply, deeply entrenched historical pattern. If you just look back at the timeline, the pattern is unmistakable. Think about the 2008 Mumbai attacks or the 2019 Pulwama bombing. In both cases, Pakistani leaders initially denied any involvement, sometimes even denied the groups responsible were on their soil at all, yet subsequent evidence, often painstakingly gathered, later linked those Pakistan-based groups Lashkar-e-Taiba, the SAP and Jaish-e-Mohammed, back to Pakistani soil, and crucially, often back to elements within the Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI.
And this history, it's exactly why you hear neutral international observers, think tanks, talk about Pakistan having this profound credibility deficit.
That term is absolutely key. Neutral organizations, think tanks like the Lowy Institute in Australia, Chatham House in the UK, they explicitly point to this deficit. They emphasize that credible reports year after year consistently show that militant safe havens continue to persist, continue to operate from Pakistani territory, often just under different names or aliases, even while the government issues these sweeping denials. These reports suggest Pakistan really hasn't managed to permanently dismantle the operational and, importantly, the financial infrastructure of these groups.
Okay, but let's play devil's advocate for a moment. For the Pahalgam attack specifically, if India didn't release that public smoking gun, the phone intercept connecting it to Islamabad, or a captured foreign operative, doesn't Pakistan kind of win the immediate diplomatic argument?
Strategically, in the short term, yes, perhaps. That's the genius and also the inherent risk of this concept of plausible deniability. For Pahalgam, because India didn't or couldn't publicly release that kind of direct, irrefutable evidence linking it straight to the Pakistani state leadership or military command, well, it gives Islamabad room to maneuver. They can stand up in front of the global community and say, look, you've shown us arrests of local facilitators, you've pointed to rhetoric, but where's the concrete, verifiable proof of state involvement? And this allows them to maintain that facade of non-involvement, even though, as the sources strongly suggest, the sustained skepticism from international observers remains incredibly high based on that historical pattern.
Okay, so if the immediate attribution and denial were, let's say, murky, we have to look deeper. We need to look at the actual organizational structure that intelligence sources believe carried out the strike. And the consensus seems to be that you have to follow the trail from the Resistance Front TRF back to its parent organization, Lashkar-e-Taiba.
Yes, this is almost a textbook example of a proxy rebranding strategy. TRF emerged, really gained prominence after India revoked Article 370 back in 2019. And it likely wasn't some spontaneous uprising. It looks much more like an organizational shift, specifically designed to adapt to that new political reality in Kashmir.
And the sources highlight their branding was very strategic, wasn't it? They positioned themselves as an indigenous Kashmiri movement, which is significant because they deliberately avoid that overt, hardline Islamist rhetoric, the kind that would immediately draw scrutiny from global counterterrorism bodies like, say, the Financial Action Task Force.
Exactly. They try to paint the violence as internal, maybe even secular resistance. It provides Islamabad with that crucial extra layer of deniability. However, intelligence agencies across the board, not just India's, widely view TRF as basically a front group, a proxy. New wine in an old Leti bottle, essentially.
And Leti, well, it's not some small new outfit we're talking about here. This is a major, globally designated terrorist organization with a long, bloody history.
Leti is really foundational to cross-border militancy in this region. It goes way back to the late 1980s. It was co-founded with support from figures who later became huge players in the global jihadist movement, people like Osama bin Laden, Abdullah Azzam. And crucially, Leti has this long documented history of being nurtured, of receiving direct patronage from elements within Pakistan's ISI. Their infamous track record includes the 2001 Indian Parliament attack, the horrific 2008 Mumbai massacre. I mean, the organization is designated as terrorist by both the UN and the US.
Okay, so if TRF is essentially Leti in disguise, what concrete evidence do we have beyond intelligence speculation to actually support this link? We need the specifics here.
Well, we have several pretty compelling pieces of evidence detailed in the sources. First, there's formal international designation. In July 2025, just months after the Pahalgam attack, the United States formally designated TRF as a Leti proxy. That's a significant international acknowledgement of the connection. It's not just India saying it anymore.
Right. And what about the investigative evidence, the stuff found on the ground?
India's National Investigation Agency, the NIA, they reportedly uncovered quite extensive digital and financial evidence. This included things like detailed financial transfers, often using those informal Hawala networks, which are hard to track phone intercepts, often from encrypted apps, and digital footprints, all linking TRF operatives directly back to Leti handlers operating inside Pakistan. They apparently found communications showing coordinated planning, funding, demonstrating that the orders and the resources were coming from outside.
That level of detail, it really suggests a deep, ongoing relationship, doesn't it? Not just some casual association.
It certainly does. And beyond the hard data, the digital stuff, there's also the shared operational infrastructure. You look at TRF's tactics, its recruitment methods, its focus on civilian soft targets, especially those with that anti-Hindu sectarian focus, like we saw so tragically in Pahalgam. It all mirrors established Leti practices. It's like the same organizational DNA. And that initial claim of responsibility, quickly followed by that hasty retraction, well, that only further solidified the view among investigators that handlers were scrambling, trying to do damage control to protect the very diplomatic cover that TRF was specifically designed to provide in the first place.
Okay, this is where the Pahalgam crisis really escalates, moving beyond just proxy groups and into the realm of direct state accountability. Because India didn't just blame Leti. They alleged the attack was actually sanctioned at the absolute highest levels of the Pakistani military establishment.
Right.
Now, that is an explosive claim, and it centers not on, say, a weapon or money, but on words, spoken words.
It's this idea of a nexus between provocative speech and violent action. India's claim, fundamentally, is that the attack was greenlit by the military leadership itself. And the core piece of evidence they cited, the one highlighted by New Delhi officials, is a speech delivered by Pakistan's Army Chief, General Syed Asim Munir, and crucially, delivered in Queens, New York, just days before the Pahalgam attack.
A speech in New York dictating violence in Kashmir. That seems like a huge leap. How did India's External Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar, how did he specifically connect that speech to the timing of the assault?
Well, Jaishankar and other officials, they characterized General Munir's remarks, which, according to reports, really emphasized Pakistan's distinct identity from Hindus as deliberately incendiary. They argued that these remarks acted as a specific dog whistle, a political signal coming from the very top brass, essentially instructing or at least sanctioning proxies like TRF-LT to escalate anti-Hindu violence within Kashmir. The argument is that this speech created the necessary political cover, maybe even the motivation for the strike to happen when it did.
The timing. The timing certainly lends some circumstantial weight to India's argument, doesn't it? We have seen historically that militant attacks sometimes spike after particularly escalatory rhetoric from leadership.
That's the core of their point. Their argument isn't necessarily that it was a direct tactical or operational order like, go attack Pahalgam now.
Yeah.
It's more likely framed as a strategic signal, maybe a lifting of prior restraint, that militant groups on the ground understand very clearly. It's part of a pattern where state-level political messaging provides the atmosphere, the permission structure for violence to erupt.
We have to pause here, though. For balance and, adhering to neutrality, The sources also offer perspectives that caution against just accepting India's immediate definitive blame without that public proof.
Yes, this is absolutely essential for a proper deep dive. Neutral analysts, you see commentary from places like the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. They were quick to caution. They said, look, while the timing is definitely suspicious, India's immediate, very detailed public blaming without full transparency, well, it risks undermining their overall credibility in the long run. They point out that in previous crises, both sides have been accused, sometimes fairly, of using quick attribution for political gain. They stress the fundamental need for independent, verifiable proof, like those intercepted orders we mentioned, to conclusively link high-level political rhetoric to specific terrorist operations. Otherwise, it remains a contested claim, basically a political argument, in the diplomatic arena.
And we also saw, woven into this external crisis, a deeply internal political allegation surface as well.
Yes, that was interesting. Some Pakistani dissidents, reportedly speaking anonymously, alleged internally that General Munir might have actually used the attack or subsequent crisis for a domestic political objective, specifically strengthening his own internal position within the complex power structure, perhaps even making a case for promotion to the very rarely used title of Field Marshal. Now, that's highly speculative, okay? And it's not supported by external sources we've seen. But it does illustrate the deeply factionalized nature of Pakistan's political military establishment, where sometimes external crises can be leveraged for internal power struggles.
Regardless of the public proof, or lack thereof, India's response certainly confirms how seriously they took this alleged speech attack nexus. Tell us more about that military response, Operation Sindoor.
Right. Operation Sindoor, this was India's military retaliation, launched in May 2025, so fairly quickly after the Pahalgam attack. According to New Delhi, the operation involved targeted, limited strikes across the line of control in Kashmir. They specifically said they were aiming at alleged terrorist infrastructure training camps, launch pads associated with Lati and TRF. The sources suggest this was probably a highly calibrated response, likely using airborne assets, maybe drones or precision missile strikes, something designed to inflict damage on that militant infrastructure without escalating to the level of, say, the large-scale aerial dogfights or troop movements we saw back in 2019 after Pulwama. It was meant as a clear, perhaps proportional signal that the alleged external orchestration of the Pahalgam attack would not be tolerated without consequence.
Okay, so Pahalgam, it's clearly a new, very dangerous chapter in what feels like a very old book of conflict, doesn't it? To really get the gravity of the 2025 crisis, we have to look at it through that comparative lens, the historical arc. What are the precedents for this kind of escalation?
The timeline really is our roadmap here. It establishes this persistent, almost cyclical nature of the conflict. We can trace a pretty clear escalation cycle, often following the exact pattern of attack, attribution, and denial that we just discussed with Pahalgam.
Starting back in the new millennium, the 2001 Parliament attack at New Delhi, that was attributed to Jaish-e-Mohammed and Latay, and it triggered the massive 2001-02 India-Pakistan standoff, remember Operation Pahalgam. That mobilization involved something like 800,000 Indian troops along the border. It really showed the sheer scale of potential disaster.
The Pahalgam mobilization was huge, yeah, but ultimately it ended diplomatically, didn't escalate fully. The template, though, it shifted dramatically with the 2008 Mumbai attacks, 26/11. That was attributed unequivocally to Latay. But the response wasn't immediate military mobilization. Instead, it led to massive, sustained global pressure on Pakistan and this really deep diplomatic freeze between the two countries. The focus shifted more towards counterterrorism accountability.
Then we saw the return to a more kinetic response with the 2016 Uri Army base attack. India blamed Pakistan-based militants for that, and it led to India's highly publicized announcement of conducting surgical strikes across the Lasi, which, of course, Pakistan vehemently denied ever even happened.
Exactly. And that denial, that whole episode, arguably paved the way for the most dangerous escalation before Pahalgam, the 2019 Pulwama attack. Jaish-e-Mohammed claimed responsibility for that suicide bombing, killed 40 Indian paramilitary personnel, and that led directly to India's Balakot airstrikes deep inside Pakistani airspace, targeting alleged gem camps, which was then followed by serious aerial skirmishes, remember the captured Indian pilot. The lesson India seems to have taken from 2019, according to analysis in the sources, was the perceived need for swift, targeted, and very publicized retaliation to restore deterrence. And that thinking directly informs the nature of Operation Sindoor in 2025.
So, the Pahalgam crisis, the attack, India accusing Pakistan of high-level orchestration, followed by Operation Sindoor. It's really just the latest, maybe more refined cycle of this established pattern, right? marquee attack focusing on India. India blames Lecce MTRF. Pakistan denies any state links. Some form of military action follows.
That's definitely the dominant pattern we see again and again. But the sources also provide some crucial historical counterpoints. We shouldn't paint with too broad a brush. The 2007 Samshad Express bombings, for instance, are a key example of contested attribution. That attack killed mostly Pakistani civilians on a train running between India and Pakistan. Initial theories pointed towards Pakistan-linked actors, but later the investigation shifted, leading to a domestic prosecution in India against suspected Hindu extremists.
And what was the final outcome of that very complex case?
Well, that domestic prosecution ultimately failed. All the suspects were acquitted back in 2019, citing lack of evidence, so the case remains officially unresolved. And that event is critical because it reminds us that violence and terrorism in South Asia, while it can spring from multiple, sometimes very complex sources, including internal domestic extremism, it's not always solely about the cross-border proxy network. Attribution isn't always clean-cut.
Right. Now, let's make sure we emphasize the other side of the ledger here. Pakistan as a victim of terrorism.
Yeah.
Because the internal toll documented in the source material, it's just devastating.
Oh, absolutely catastrophic. Pakistan has suffered these horrific internal attacks from groups like the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP, that's the Pakistani Taliban. They have operational links to the Afghan Taliban and also the Islamic State Khorasan province, ISKP. Since 2001, literally tens of thousands of Pakistani civilians, soldiers, police officers have perished in terrorist incidents. The sheer scale of the human cost inside Pakistan cannot be overstated.
The 2014 Peshawar Army public school attack. That really stands out as a national trauma, a turning point, doesn't it?
It was an unbelievable national trauma. That TTP attack, where around 150 people were killed, including 132 children, it forced a fundamental policy shift in Pakistan. It led directly to the creation of the National Action Plan, which was supposed to be this comprehensive framework to combat domestic terrorism much more seriously. But the attacks continued. More recently, the 2023 Peshawar police line's mosque bombing that killed over 80 people, mostly police officers. It just shows this brutal internal siege continues. These groups are actively trying to destabilize the Pakistani state itself.
And finally, these attacks, they're no longer purely a domestic issue for Pakistan or even just a bilateral issue with India or Afghanistan. Attacks targeting foreign nationals, especially the Chinese, create immediate geopolitical fallout.
Yes. The 2024 Shangla Besham attack, the one that killed 5 Chinese workers who were working on the Dasu Dam project convoy. That's a perfect illustration. Beijing views the safety of its citizens involved in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, as a core national interest, non-negotiable. So that attack instantly made China a direct and probably very demanding stakeholder in Pakistan's internal security situation. It added immense pressure on Islamabad to clean up its internal militant landscape, perhaps far faster and more comprehensively than India alone could ever manage to compel.
Okay, so this detailed historical overview brings us right back to that central contradiction we identified at the start, this strategic schizophrenia, if you will, of Pakistan's double game.
Mm-hmm.
How can one state seemingly simultaneously harbor, nurture, sponsor groups for external aims, while suffering this immense, almost existential internal blowback from other groups? It seems fundamentally unstable.
It is an incredibly unstable and ultimately tragic dynamic. On the one hand, the evidence laid out in the sources confirming Pakistan as, at minimum, a permissive environment and often an active sponsor or exporter of terror, it's just overwhelming. We know camps run by Jem and others continue to operate from Pakistani territory. They might relocate, they might rebrand, like with TRF, but they maintain functionality. And the training, the funding, the logistical support, intelligence reports consistently allege involvement from crucial elements within the ISI.
And that proxy strategy, using groups like TRF, that's the operational tool for this external agenda, right?
It's the mechanism of choice, it seems. It allows Pakistan to maintain that crucial, plausible deniability while strategically sustaining the low-intensity conflict, particularly in Kashmir. It reflects what appears to be a calculated decision over decades to use militancy as a primary instrument of foreign policy, specifically against India. And the Pahalgam attack fits perfectly within that established policy framework.
Yet the internal victim status is equally real, equally devastating, as we just discussed.
Absolutely. The casualty figures inside Pakistan tragically confirm their victimhood. And let's not forget, during the height of the U.S. war on terror post-9/11, Pakistan also functioned as a crucial counter-terror ally for Washington. They provided vital logistical supply routes into Afghanistan, air bases, critical intelligence that led directly to the capture or killing of key al-Qaeda operatives. So they were actively fighting one form of terrorism on behalf of the global community.
So they were fighting al-Qaeda, cooperating with the U.S., while simultaneously, allegedly, supporting Lekti against India. I mean, that's the very definition of selective counterterrorism, isn't it?
It is, precisely. They cooperate against transnational threats groups like al-Qaeda, ISKP groups that actively try to overthrow the Pakistani state itself or attack Western interests. But they appear to tolerate or even nurture India-focused militants like LOT and its proxies like TRF, because those groups are viewed as strategic assets for foreign policy leverage against India. And this is where the blowback phenomenon becomes so critical. Groups that were once fostered or at least tolerated, especially within the complex ecosystem linked to the Afghan Taliban, have spawned offshoots like the TTP that now view the Pakistani state itself as their primary enemy.
So the unsustainable contradiction, the trap, is that by using militancy as a strategic asset against one neighbor, they inadvertently created, or at least allowed, an operational environment where other militant groups could flourish and eventually turn against the state itself.
That seems to be the ultimate strategic trap they've fallen into. The evidence, taken as a whole, suggests Pakistan can and does simultaneously harbor terrorists, suffer horrifically from terrorism, and fight certain terrorist groups. It's this incredibly complex, dangerous strategic calculation that has undeniably brought immense domestic instability and significant diplomatic isolation. Pahalgam is simply the latest, very stark reminder that this double game, well, it creates these irreconcilable security realities for Islamabad.
Okay, so this deep dive into the Pahalgam crisis, tracing the TRF-LT link, the historical pattern of denial, dissecting these internal strategic contradictions, it really forces us to consider the implications moving forward for regional stability. So, starting with India, what are the primary takeaways?
Well, for India, I think Pahalgam reinforces a very difficult reality. That enduring peace in Kashmir, it remains hostage to this external factor. As long as genuine accountability for Pakistan-based groups remains elusive, India feels it must sustain this state of continuous vigilance, backed up by the credible threat of limited, targeted military responses like Operation Sindoor, simply to maintain deterrence and protect its own population. It's a reactive posture, fundamentally.
And for Pakistan, the immediate takeaway must be the sheer unsustainability of this strategy, surely.
It highlights an operational and, frankly, a political threat to their very existence. The long-term reliance on this double game, it fuels devastating domestic instability through groups like the TTP. It strains diplomatic relations, not just with India, but with vital partners like China now and the U.S. historically. And it perpetually hobbles their economic growth potential. Containing the internal blowback is now arguably a greater challenge for Islamabad than managing the external conflict with India.
And the global consequences, clearly extending beyond just the subcontinent now, seem clearer than ever before.
Absolutely. The militant ecosystem that produced the Pahalgam attack, it doesn't respect borders. It inherently threatens regional and global stability. We talked about the consequences of that 2024 Dasu Dam attack on Chinese workers. It drew a great power, Beijing, directly into Pakistan's internal security matrix. That just raises the geopolitical stakes exponentially in a region already defined by the terrifying risk of nuclear escalation. The world really cannot afford for these flashpoints to multiply.
So after synthesizing all these sources, from the specific NIA findings on the ground to the long historical patterns of denial and the analysis from neutral think tanks, what is the final inescapable reality we need to leave with you, the listener?
I think the key lesson, the core takeaway from Pahalgam in this entire historical timeline we've traced is this. The strategic space that terror groups exploit most effectively is ambiguity. Militancy thrives in that gap, the space deliberately created between state denial, covert sponsorship, plausible deniability, and self-proclaimed victimhood. This ambiguity, you could argue, is maintained, perhaps even cultivated, by actors on both sides for various strategic reasons. But it is the primary persistent source of danger to South Asian stability and ultimately to international peace. Without concerted internal effort and maybe significant external pressure to eliminate that ambiguity, that space for deniability, well, the tragic escalation cycle we've discussed today seems destined to continue indefinitely.
That is the profound and perhaps irreducible challenge facing South Asia today. We've traced the Pahalgam attack back to its alleged proxies and lessee via TRF. We've established that long historical pattern of denial and dissected the deep, dangerous strategic schizophrenia inherent in Pakistan's complex role. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope the synthesis provides you with, well, at least some of the clarity needed to navigate the ongoing complexities of this critical geopolitical flashpoint.